Hello and welcome to the Just Here in the Dark podcast with me, your host, Sean. I want to thank you so much for checking out the podcast on this Weird Wednesday. As always, you can check out the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio is still pending, of course, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. Also, you can find more content such as strange short stories on my Instagram page, which is the Just Here in the Dark podcast. But without any further ado, let's get into our stories. This next story comes to us from grunge.com. When Rico Harris's girlfriend last heard from him, it was by voicemail. He'd been on the road, traveling from his family's home in Los Angeles back to Seattle to reunite with his girlfriend, Jennifer Song. It was an unexpected 1,100-mile trip for the 37-year-old former semi-pro basketball player who had never mentioned to Song that he planned to drive to California in the first place, according to sportscasting. Unfortunately, the erratic behavior was not out of character for Harris at that point in his life. Sportscasting reports that Harris had struggled after leaving basketball and had developed problems with drugs and alcohol. Though he'd been sober for several years, something prompted Harris to make a spur-of-the-moment trip to Los Angeles. A punishing drive in the best of circumstances made even more taxing by the fact that Harris reportedly hadn't slept in 36 hours. Somewhere near Sacramento, says the blog Disappeared, Harris left his girlfriend that cryptic voicemail, telling her he planned to go up into the mountains to rest. It was the last anyone heard from Rico Harris. Rico Harris was the oldest of four siblings, born in the Los Angeles suburb area in 1977 to parents who would later divorce. Harris's mother, says Disappeared, worked hard to care for the kids on a modest income, but explained that Rico was the glue that held the family together. He was a talented hooper in high school, says sportscasting, and was considered to be a strong college prospect. Harris began his college career at Arizona State University, but soon ran into trouble with the law. Not much is known of the incident that led to an arrest for unlawful imprisonment. Regardless, Harris soon returned to a school much closer to home. He led the LA City College team to its first state championship before transferring again to Cal State Northridge. By all accounts, the future looked bright. Soon, Harris was playing for an iconic Harlem Globetrotters. True, it was no NBA gig, but it was a living playing the sport Harris loved. Things took a turn in the year 2000, though. At some point, says Disappeared, Harris was the victim of an assault that left him with head injury so severe he was forced to leave the Globetrotters after just 1 month. It was the beginning of a dangerous downward spiral for Rico Harris. According to Disappeared, the years between 2000 and 2007 were extremely rough for Harris, who returned home to live with his family and developed a drug and alcohol problem. Sportscasting uncovered a series of Harris's arrests, ranging from trespassing to burglary, that illustrated how out of control his life had become. The year 2007 was a brief turning point, though. As Harris got sober, he began his relationship with Song and held a job working security, reports Disappeared. Harris managed to stay sober for 7 years, a remarkable feat. In 2014, Harris left California to move in with Song in Seattle. In October of that year, Harris had made a seemingly spontaneous decision to drive to LA to work out some family issues. Under normal conditions, the trip between the two West Coast cities would take around 18 hours to drive. Harris apparently drove it all the same day, reaching LA in time to talk with his mother and have dinner with one of his brothers. Despite the arduous trip, Harris made the decision to return to Seattle around 1 a.m. About 7 hours later, Harris stopped for gas and talked with his girlfriend, who learned he'd been awake for 36 hours. A few hours later, he left her a voicemail with an ominous update about heading for the mountains. On October 14th, reports Sportscasting, Harris's car was found in the parking lot of a park in Northern California's Yolo County. Despite extensive searching, Harris has never been found. The story doesn't end there, though. Stories of the Unsolved detail some concerning twists in the investigation, including that police had traced a ping from Harris's cell phone that indicated the phone was more than 70 miles from where the car was found. Further, compounding the mystery, the car appeared to have been ransacked as well as being out of gas and having a dead battery. Reportedly, investigators wonder why Harris had been on this particular stretch of road at all, since it was so far from the I-5 freeway, the direct route from LA to Seattle. Soon, a man called the police to let them know he had found a backpack and cell phone that he believed belonged to Harris. The phone included video of Harris ripping things up in his car and throwing his CDs. While that explained the appearance of the car, it didn't shed any light on Harris's perplexing behavior. While a few people have come forward to claim they saw Harris near the area where he went missing, nothing conclusive points to the reason why Harris was in the area or behaving erratically. Despite extensive searching, neither Harris nor his remains had ever been found. His girlfriend and family says stories of the unsolved continue to keep the case alive. Our next story comes to us from allthat'sinteresting.com. In 1931, Dr. Carl Tanzer fell in love with the patient he was treating for tuberculosis. This love made him determined to keep his patient alive, which he attempted to do quite literally by removing her corpse from the mausoleum it was housed in and holding it together with coat hangers, wax, and silk. Carl Tanzer was born in 1877 and reportedly studied weather patterns in Austria in 1910, where he stayed until the end of World War I. Upon returning home, Tanzer married and had 2 children in 1920, and the family immigrated to Zephyr Hills, Florida. Tanzer quickly abandoned his wife after accepting a position as a radiological technician in Key West, where he worked at the U.S. Marine Hospital under the name Count von Kassel. When a Cuban-American woman named Maria Elena Malargo de Hoyos walked into the hospital, the doctor saw before him an actual dream come true. Born in Key West in 1909, the daughter of the cigar maker and homemaker, Hoyos was raised in a large family and was brought to the hospital by her mother after becoming ill. As a young boy in Germany, Tanzer would often have visions of a stunning, dark-haired woman who was predestined to be his one true love. The 22-year-old beauty resembled his childhood premonition so closely that he immediately became convinced that their love was meant to be. Unfortunately for them both, Tanzler's prognosis for young Hoyos was not great, having diagnosed her with tuberculosis, which was still considered to be a fatal disease in the early 1900s. Despite the lack of qualifications needed to treat a tuberculosis patient, Tanzler was determined to save Hoyos and used a variety of specially made toxins, elixirs, and medicines in an effort to do so. Carl Tanzler administered these treatments in Hoyos' family home, showering her in gifts and declaring his love all the while. Despite his best efforts, Hoyos succumbed to her illness in October 1931, leaving her family and newly obsessed caretaker heartbroken. Tanzler insisted on purchasing a pricey stone mausoleum in Key West Cemetery for her remains to lay, and with her parents' permission, hired a mortician to prepare her body before locking her inside. Hoyos' family then realized that the only key to the tomb would remain in Tanzler's possession. Tanzler would quickly take advantage of his privilege, which would result in one of the most macabre tales of all time. Tanzler visited Hoyos' grave every night for nearly 2 years, a habit that stopped abruptly after he lost his job for reasons unknown. While her family did consider this drastic change in behavior to be a bit strange, they could not have imagined the reasoning behind it. In April of 1933, Carl Tanzler removed Hoyas' body from the mausoleum, no longer requiring him to make his nightly visits to the graveyard, as she would now be housed in his own home. Now 2 years deceased, Carl Tanzler was left with the task of maintaining Hoya's corpse. He did this as needed, inside an old airplane he had repurposed into a makeshift medical laboratory. There, he looked to a number of DIY tricks to keep the young woman's decaying body intact, including plaster of Paris and glass eyes to maintain the integrity of her face, as well as coat hangers and other wires to stabilize her skeletal frame. He had stuffed her torso with rags in an attempt to preserve its original form. He covered her scalp with bits of real hair. Tanzler added copious amounts of perfume, flowers, disinfectants, and preserving agents to keep the rotting odor at bay, and routinely applied mortician's wax to Hoyas' face in an effort to keep her alive. Carl Tanzler had the corpse wrapped in a dress, gloves, and jewelry, and placed the body in his own bed, which he shared with the corpse for the next 7 years, with pretty much the entire town talking about the reclusive man often seen buying women's clothing and perfume, on top of one local boy's account of witnessing the doctor dancing with what appeared to be a giant doll. Hoyas' family began to suspect that something was off. After Hoyas' sister showed up at Tanzler's home in 1940, the jig was up. There, she found what she believed to be a life-size effigy of her departed sister. Arriving authorities quickly determined that this doll was, in fact, Hoyas herself, and they arrested Tanzler for grave robbing. An autopsy of the body revealed the intricacies of Tanzler's work, which included a paper tube inserted between her legs, forming a makeshift vagina, although Tanzler never admitted to committing any necrophiliac acts. A psychiatric evaluation determined that Tanzler was competent to stand trial, although some reports state that his ultimate plans involved flying Hoyas high into the stratosphere so that the radiation from outer space could penetrate her tissue and restore life to her somnolent form. Despite everything, the statute of limitations had expired for the crime he was accused of committing, leaving Tanzler free to go. Hoyas' body was placed on display at a local funeral home where nearly 7,000 people came to see the corrupted corpse for themselves. Her body was finally laid to rest once and for all in an unmarked grave in Key West Cemetery. Carl Tanzler actually received quite a bit of compassion during his trial, with some even viewing him as a hopeless, albeit eccentric, romantic. Nevertheless, he went to live out the rest of his days alone and died in his home in 1952, where he was discovered 3 weeks after his passing. Alright, I'm ending the podcast right here. I want to thank you so much for checking it out on this Weird Wednesday. I typically do a third story, but these stories ran longer than I anticipated. I usually try to stick to like a 3-minute, 4-minute story format for each article, but these were interesting, so I just went along with these anyway. But you can always go back and check out my previous podcasts and the stories I covered in those. Also, you can go check out Strange Short Stories on my Instagram page, which is the Just Here in the Dark podcast on Instagram. Also, like, share, engage, and you can send some comments at me, send me some suggestions on stories or news articles that you might like to hear covered. With that being said, until next time.